May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his. And anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free from economic hardship and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today we're going to have more material from Work in Progress, Tassajara Stories. We'll get right into reading this material just as soon as we've had our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause if you want to play along with it, and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come back, hit unpause. And we'll be there and we'll hit the bell to end the meditation or whatever, and we'll read some more from Tassajara Stories. Kathy. Before the first practice period, Kathy Cook had gone to Suzuki and suggested that we get started making robes for Tassajara students. He gave her one of his work robes as an example of what he thought might be appropriate for lay students. She'd done a lot of sewing before, but this was put together in ways she'd never seen. She laid it out to figure out how it was made. It had elastic at the wrist of the sleeves, a pleated skirt, and hung straight with a dropped shoulder. She worked hard to try to come up with some facsimile suitable for us with a slightly different design, made a pattern, and started sewing. Those were the first robes we used at Tassajara. They were a gray cotton poly mixture. Kathy recalls, we had a wonderful sewing room at Tassajara, and once the design was decided on, we started producing them. We worked in the lower barn by the stream. We had these old treadle sewing machines, and I was head of the sewing crew. I have a picture of myself from there, and I was so happy. It is the best picture of me from my whole lifetime. I felt empowered by Suzuki Roshi, and I felt like he was supporting my practice. And I had a wonderful job to do, and I was working with good friends. Suzuki Roshi came up to me one day and said, "You're doing very well, and I don't mean in terms of success and failure." This was my golden period as a single student. Kathy was quite attractive. One day when she brought a sample of her work to Suzuki, he told her, "You're too charming." She wondered if she should make robes out of sackcloth and ashes. The next fabric I brought to him as a candidate for winter robes was a heavy, rough woolen weave. I actually spent a lot of time during those early years trying to figure out designs for Zendo wear that made sense for Western bodies. Also making designs for women's bodies that were different from those for men. But it was the wrong time. Some students were complaining about having to wear robes, saying it would be too regimented. She went to Suzuki upset. He told her, "I get so angry with the students because you work so hard and they don't appreciate your effort." When the drive to buy the horse pasture got going, Baker had asked Kathy to deal with fundraising correspondence. She was the first paid employee ever for Zen Center, a decision that some people didn't like because many students were putting a lot of time in. She was in the eye of the whirlwind of what she saw as the birth of Zen Center as an institution. A thermometer chart went up on the wall with $20,000 at the top, the down payment that was needed. Suzuki looked at it and said to Kathy, "If we can raise the first $1,000, we can do it." Kathy had been around for a while when Zen Center was smaller and had had time to get to know Suzuki and Oak-san. She talked with him about women and children and psychology. She'd been working at the Jung Institute. He told her Jungian psychology seemed much closer to the spirit of Zen than Freudian. She recalls, "I remember him trying to teach me how to slurp when I ate noodles." Oak-san was serving us udon noodles, and being as shy as I am, it was really hard for me to suck them in and make a noise, which is the way he wanted. So he'd kid me about that and try to show me how to do it. But he had time in those days for that kind of thing, so you could go over and just hang out. He asked me to quit smoking, saying, "You can do it." I couldn't, at least not then. Kathy's mother came to Tassajara. They had tea with Suzuki. Later he told Kathy, "In Japan we say fighting the curtain. You're still fighting the curtain. And then, when your mother dies, you'll know how lonely you are." Kathy had a chronic problem with pain in one knee when she sat. She'd had an operation years earlier and had a damaged knee. She said the pain was horrendous. It was greater than the everyday pain that most of us experienced. Suzuki encouraged her to sit with the pain. She didn't really feel like it benefited her, but she did her best. Out of faith in Suzuki Roshi's way, she said. Finally, she listened to her body instead of Suzuki and started sitting in a chair. Suzuki Roshi encouraged me to go back to cross-legged sitting as a way of strengthening my knee, but he was completely wrong on that one. I was his anja for one practice period before I had Amber. He asked me not to wash his clothes so often because they would get worn out. I was just beginning to get interested in gardening. I worked with him in his garden, and he had a simple and direct relationship with the earth. There was the steep hillside above his cabin. It was eroding, and he asked me to put plants up there. I remember him gardening in his underwear at Tassajara during the summer. He was wearing like a white t-shirt and some kind of white cotton breeches about knee length. He was able to squat on the earth in front of a row of plants in the garden and be so balanced. Someone brought a plant to him that wasn't so well, and he took it and tended to it till it was healthy. He said not to give the plants too much water, but to water the stones near the plants. He said to me, "I love stones too much." He talked about the importance of planting the seeds and nurturing them, and how human they are. Suzuki talked to Kathy about having a farm and said we should just go out to the Salinas Valley and do it just the way other farmers do it. That we don't need to have some special way. He had no idea what agribusiness farming in Salinas was like, though, and that we were not going to be on that scale or doing it that way. He also said to her, "You can't always be a wise man." She recalls, "When I first came to Berkeley in 1959, my boyfriend had this game, 'Tell me who you are in 3 words. I said, 'Kathy, girl, thinker.' At the first Shosan question and answer ceremony, I asked Suzuki Roshi some question which mentioned from the heights to the depths, and he said, 'Your understanding is correct, but it's not real. Try not to think so much.'" Kathy was thriving back there in the early days of Tassajara. Everything was working for her. But winter was not that far off. When I was working on a reunion for early students at Tassajara, I got an email from a woman who was at the first practice period with her husband. They'd been sitting at Sokoji from before I came. They moved to Boulder when Trungpa set up shop there. In her email, she let me know she had no interest in attending the reunion. She expressed resentment about her experience as a woman at Zen Center, the status of women at Zen Center, and said that she did not feel respected or appreciated there. She did not have that problem at all with Trungpa's group. That was the only negative response I can recall from hundreds of people I'd contacted, but I sympathized. I remember when Gloria became the first female to drive the town trip and the flatbed trucks. Paul wanted her to get materials for work that was going on. He trusted her judgment to come back with the right stuff. There was some resistance, but Gloria was a serious, competent person, and at least for her, that barrier evaporated and made it easier for other women to follow. As is true everywhere always, there were various assumptions about gender embedded in our thinking. Some assumptions would be challenged, and some, of course, wouldn't. Men were digging the pits for the septic tanks, and women were in the sewing room. But there were women digging in the garden, and that was hard to dig in. Some guys started learning how to operate the treadle sewing machines. I made some curtains to separate the toilet and sink area from the rest of the cabin where I was living. Society at large was evolving. Tassajara was evolving. In the mid-'70s, in a spring staff meeting about positions for the upcoming guest season, we were figuring out who'd be in the kitchen. Except for the Tenzo, the head of the kitchen staff were assigned to either the crew for student meals or guest meals. Gender didn't figure much in those choices. The idea was to rotate positions so that the student meal crew might be mostly new people with little consideration about experience. But for the guest cooks, experience and skill mattered. Ramona was a good cook with experience, But when it was suggested she be the head guest cook, immediately her temperament was brought up. She's too aggressive and emotional, too loud, too bossy. At first that might have ruled her out, but it was batted down with, "You wouldn't say that if she was a guy." Suzuki had many strong women students from when he first arrived. He arranged for Jean Ross to study in Japan in the early 60s at Eiji. She was the president of Zen Center before Richard Baker. Ross was the third Shuso head monk at Tassajara and had her own sitting group in Carmel. We had a practice period without a Shuso because Suzuki insisted we wait for her. Trudy Dixon, who died in 1969, he'd called a great Zen master and said he'd never hoped to have a disciple that great. In the Sokoji Zendo, there was a woman's side and a men's side. At Tassajara, there was some separation of the sexes by rows in the Zendo, but it didn't last long. Up to them, people came to Sokoji and left after service or lecture. They were on their own. At Tassajara, a bunch of us moved in together, and there was a round-the-clock schedule, structure, and administration. Men and women were practicing side by side at Tassajara, but men were clearly running the place. They were all good guys who felt a lot of pressure on their metaphorical shoulders. There was always some low level of grumbling from those of us with less authority, but I don't recall it being more from females than their counterparts. Suzuki wondered if he was the right teacher for women in this context. This sort of start from him started with Tassajara. He was hesitant to ordain women as priests. He wasn't sure what course their training would follow. A woman who'd been around for years and whom Tim Buckley told me he admired as a strong sitter said, Suzuki Roshi inasmuch said to me that he did not know what to do with female students. I was there at the first training period, and I never felt that I lacked for being able to approach him or work with him. But I think culturally it did confuse him wondering how to work with female students. He initially envisioned Tassajara as being only men, and Dick Baker said that's not going to fly here, so he had already expressed some reservations. It just never occurred to him. Precursors of a new women's liberation movement were sprouting up in Europe and America and at Tassajara. The status and conduct of women in our subculture was a departure from American norms and much more so from what our Japanese teachers were used to. They were having to adjust so much, though, that to them it was just part of a larger foreign package. Yoshimura adjusted with ease to the role of women in our quasi-monastic setting. He said that in America, Zen was new, hip, cool, and in Japan it was stuck in tradition. He said that Zen priests who came to America were on the whole pretty open-minded, and that women here were socially more like men compared to Japanese women. And then there's Tatsugami, he added, smiling. Mel said that Tatsugami turned Tassajara from a community into a monastery. Even before he came practice period and family life didn't mix well, in the early, more communal days, the idea was that families could live there in the practice period. Couples worked out okay, but it was not a good place then for kids old enough to run around. It was too confining for them and didn't sync well with the much quieter environment and more demanding Zendo schedule. Adjustments were made for occasional babies during practice periods, with couples taking turns to attend zazen and services, unless one had to always attend Zendo services, such as when I was head monk. The bulk of the responsibility usually fell to the mother. Diane and I did have a great deal of help, though, from students who loved taking care of our son Kelly when he was a baby. Mike Jamvold and Mark Lewis would show up eager on their breaks and days off to put him in a snuggly and walk around visiting and exploring. The guest season was not so affected, though, and continued to be a haven for families and children. The few pregnant women there were had a hard time being at Tassajara during those early practice periods as they tried to continue being students. And there was an expectation from the other students that they follow the schedule just like everyone else. Paul's wife, Ruthie, didn't have that problem. From the first, she was there as a spouse, not a student. And even when she was hugely pregnant, she kept on working energetically in the garden or on the grounds. She recalls, Suzuki Roshi was very supportive of my being pregnant at Tassajara and having Benjamin at Tassajara after he was born. I thought it was a great privilege being pregnant there. All I was worried about was getting enough protein. I didn't even want to leave there to have the baby, but I had to. Ben was born during sesshin, where everyone is silent, and I came home from the hospital and people would come into the cabin and nobody said anything. Right after Ben was born, Paul was carrying him and Suzuki Roshi came over and started talking to Ben. Ruthie said it was easier for her than for Kathy Hoadley, who was the first woman student to be pregnant at Tassajara. Ruthie got some practice there by helping to take care of Kathy and Silas's daughter, Amber. Kathy went down to Tassajara without Silas when she was pregnant. Suzuki Roshi was there, she said, and I did pretty well. He said, you should stay here, and the implication was to stay there and have the baby and forget about Silas. But after she gave birth, it didn't work out well at all for her. She heard Suzuki say that if one person in a family were to practice, the whole family would benefit. That was not her experience. Whatever the valuable, positive things I gained as a single woman were totally lost in the situation of being a wife and mother. One of the worst periods of my life was being at Tassajara with Amber while Silas was being Shuso and director. I had had a serious nervous breakdown after her birth, poor girl. Her early infancy must have been terrifying, and I really hadn't recovered when Suzuki Roshi wanted Silas at Tassajara. That environment was about the opposite of what I needed to regain my balance, and I got worse there. I remember Suzuki Roshi saying to me, get a clear picture of your illness and accept it. When I got married with Silas and had Amber, I lost the relationship I had with Suzuki Roshi. I didn't have time to be with him or to be involved with Zendo activities. Silas was important to Zen Center, and Suzuki Roshi said to me, I need Silas to be at Tassajara, to be director and to be Shuso, and your family life will have to be sacrificed. That did not sit well with me. I felt like I was being asked to be a Japanese priest's wife, but since Suzuki Roshi had asked me, I felt like I should try to do that. But it didn't work at all. I went to Tassajara and moved into cabin 16 with Amber and was with her all day. I couldn't do any work. I couldn't go to the Zendo. Silas firmly believed that nobody should help me with child care because they were there to practice. I basically flipped out in this situation. The stress was more than I could handle. I didn't feel that Suzuki Roshi supported me at all anymore or didn't support me to do anything but to take care of the baby. That was extremely difficult. I still have resentment about the way I was treated at that time. I felt like if I'd talked to Oksan, she'd have just rubber stamped what Suzuki Roshi said. I kept trying to fit into that role, but I was just dying in it. There was absolutely no one to turn to. Later, when there were more kids, I didn't feel so isolated. But when I was the first one, it was really, really difficult. The thing that stood out for me was when Suzuki Roshi said, just don't lose your own way. I remember him saying that in the midst of all the anxiety that was going on. The first one through makes a space by being there if they do it well or badly. The next one makes a little bit more and on and on. Now the space is much more opened up in Zen Center. Suzuki Roshi got it that men and women wanted to practice together in the same community, and he got it that couples wanted to live together without being married, and he gave that his blessing as long as they were responsible to the community that they were a part of. He was very forward-thinking in that regard. But to make the next step of how we would integrate mothers and children, I don't think he ever went there. We didn't even know what the problems were. And then he started to get sick and his energy was elsewhere. It never occurred to me to talk to Suzuki Roshi about my situation because he'd asked me to sacrifice. Suzuki Roshi remains for me an archetype. The impression that he made on me remains a part of who I am. He gave my psyche the impression that certain things were possible that I didn't know about before. He demonstrated the possibilities to me of what I could be. The message I got from him was, because I've traveled this way and because I'm an ordinary human being like you, I know you can do it too. So that's today's material from a work in progress, Tassajara Stories. Yeah, sort of a bummer, huh? Yeah. Yeah, and I'm dying to comment when I read it, you know, but it's pretty obvious. You know, what I want to say is we were learning back then. We didn't know what we were doing, you know, and Kathy wasn't the only mother that had a hard time. She told me all this, and this is all in her interview on Kook.com. She was happy to have it there. And there's a lot more, you know, about how she evolved and things she got into. And this is just one time in her life when, you know, we had this meeting of, in a sense, a meeting of Japanese culture and American culture, and Japanese and Americans wanting to study it. And in Japan, you know, the woman would raise the child and the man would go off to a monastery, just, you know, might go on for years and come on certain times. And there was no question about that. But that didn't work in America. So it was those two things meeting and, you know, just learning how to adjust and have it make sense. I guess I should mention something like that when I read. You know, I'll have to think about that. This is a difficult subject, and yeah, I'll think about it. Anyway, you know, I thought a lot when I was writing this stuff about how to present it and how it would work and what it should be next to. And clearly I have more work to do here, but to satisfy myself, which is basically all I try to do. But I think she stated things pretty well. And also, I like having the juxtaposition of her and Ruthie in there. It really worked well for Ruthie. And it worked later for people in certain situations, you know. After a while, back then, we weren't sure of ourselves. We were doing something new. And after a while, the community became more mature and took more responsibility for itself. It's just been an evolution. And institutions, communities always go through an evolution. And, mainly institutions, the main focus is for them to survive. Any institution, almost any institution. So Zen Center's done pretty good at surviving. And one thing it's had to do is learn how to deal with families and children. And I think it's done pretty well. So this has been more material from a work in progress Tassajara Stories. And so until next time, I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Doggett Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.